The chalk dust hung in the air like ghosts of forgotten lessons as Margaret Holloway stood frozen before the old blackboard, her trembling hand clutching a piece of white chalk that had snapped in half. The silence in Jefferson Elementary's abandoned classroom was deafening, the kind of silence that screams louder than any sound. Behind her, the heavy breathing of her canine partner, Rex, filled the space with an urgency that made her skin crawl. "It's just an old building, Rex," she whispered, but her voice cracked like the chalk between her fingers. "We're here to do a final security sweep before demolition. Nothing more." Rex, a magnificent German shepherd with battle scars etched along his left flank, didn't respond to her reassurance. His amber eyes were locked on something she couldn't see, his massive body rigid with the kind of tension she'd only witnessed twice before, once in Afghanistan when he'd detected an IED that saved her entire unit, and once in Detroit when he'd led police to a kidnapped child buried alive in a basement. Both times that stance had meant the difference between life and death. The afternoon sun slanted through broken windows, casting long shadows across the classroom where dust motes danced like tiny spirits. Margaret had volunteered for this final sweep through Jefferson Elementary, partly out of nostalgia. She'd been a student here 30 years ago, and partly because Rex needed the routine. Since their retirement from active duty 6 months ago, he'd grown restless, his warrior instincts seeking purpose in their quiet suburban life. But this wasn't routine. This was different. Rex's head tilted toward the chalkboard, his ears pricked forward in a way that made Margaret's military training kick in. She'd learned to read her partner's body language like scripture during their 4 years together in the Army's K-9 unit, followed by 3 years with the police force. Rex wasn't just alert. He was communicating something urgent, something that made her pulse quicken despite herself. "What is it, boy?" she asked, stepping closer to the blackboard where decades of lessons had been written and erased, leaving ghostly impressions of mathematical equations and childhood dreams. Rex approached the board with the deliberate precision of a soldier clearing a room. His nose worked the air in short, sharp sniffs, and then he did something that made Margaret's blood run cold. He began to scratch at the board, his claws scraping against the black surface with a sound like fingernails on a coffin lid. "Rex, no," she commanded, but he ignored her, something that had never happened before. Not once in 7 years of partnership had Rex disobeyed a direct command. The scratching continued, methodical and purposeful. Rex wasn't acting out of boredom or anxiety. He was trying to tell her something, his claws leaving white marks on the dark surface as he worked at a specific section of the board, about 4 feet from the left edge and 3 feet up from the bottom. Margaret laughed, a sound that came out more like a sob. "You're losing it, old friend. It's just a chalkboard in an empty school. What could possibly be—" The sound came from behind the wall, a soft click, mechanical and precise, like the turning of a lock that hadn't been opened in decades. Margaret's laughter died in her throat as she watched a section of the wall beside the chalkboard swing inward, revealing a dark opening that shouldn't exist. Her K-9 partner had found a hidden door. Rex's tail wagged once, a single satisfied sweep, before his ears flattened against his head, and he issued a low, warning growl that raised every hair on Margaret's arms. Whatever lay beyond that door, it wasn't empty, and it wasn't innocent. 4 years earlier, Forward Operating Base Chapman, Afghanistan. The explosion had been meant for Margaret. The roadside bomb buried beneath 3 months of accumulated dust and debris along Route Silver had been positioned perfectly to target the lead vehicle in their convoy. Staff Sergeant Margaret Holloway, fresh from K-9 handler training and eager to prove herself, had been riding in that lead Humvee when Rex made his first save. The German shepherd, barely 2 years old and still learning the deadly dance of bomb detection, had gone rigid exactly 47 seconds before they would have hit the trigger point. His handler, Sergeant Miller, had been killed by sniper fire just 3 weeks earlier, and Rex had been assigned to Margaret in what everyone assumed was a temporary arrangement. The dog was traumatized, they said, might never work effectively again. But Rex had saved her life that day, and in doing so had saved 12 other soldiers in the convoy. When they'd examined the IED afterward, the explosive expert had whistled low and shaken his head. "Nasty piece of work," he'd said, Would have taken out the whole front of the convoy. Your dog's got a nose for death, Sergeant. That night, in the relative safety of their forward operating base, Margaret had sat with Rex in the makeshift kennels, watching him tremble from what the veterinarian had diagnosed as post-traumatic stress. The dog who had saved her life was suffering from the same invisible wounds that plagued so many of their human counterparts. "Hey, boy," she'd whispered, offering him a piece of her MRE beef patty. "I know you miss Miller. I know this is all wrong for you, but we're going to figure it out together, okay?" Rex had looked at her with those amber eyes that had seen too much, understood too much, and something had passed between them. Not just trust, but recognition. They were both soldiers. They were both afraid, and they were both determined to keep fighting. The next 18 months had forged a bond deeper than training, stronger than duty. Rex had detected 17 more IEDs, saved countless lives, and never once failed to alert to danger. But more than that, he'd learned to read Margaret's emotions, to sense her fears and doubts, to offer comfort when the weight of command threatened to crush her spirit. When they'd both been wounded in the same mortar attack, Rex taking shrapnel, in his left flank, Margaret catching a piece of metal in her shoulder, they'd recovered in adjacent beds in the field hospital. The doctors had joked about keeping them together, but Margaret knew it wasn't a joke. Rex was her partner, her anchor, her reason for making it through the long, dark nights when the war seemed endless. 2 years later, Detroit Metropolitan Police Department. The transition to civilian police work had been challenging for both of them. The streets of Detroit were different from the mountains of Afghanistan, but danger wore the same face, and Rex's instincts had adapted quickly. They'd worked narcotics, crowd control, and search and rescue, earning commendations and the respect of their fellow officers. But it was the Morrison case that had really tested them. 8-year-old Timothy Morrison had been missing for 6 days when Rex had finally picked up the scent trail that led to an abandoned warehouse on the east side. The kidnapper had buried the boy alive in a soundproofed box in the warehouse basement, leaving him with just enough air to survive until the ransom was paid. Rex had worked for 11 hours straight, his nose pressed to the ground, following a trail that had been obscured by rain, contaminated by dozens of other scents, and deliberately masked by the perpetrator. When he'd finally led them to the warehouse, the boy had less than 2 hours of oxygen remaining. Margaret still remembered the sound of Timothy's crying when they'd pulled him from that box, and the way Rex had whimpered and licked the boy's face as the paramedics worked to stabilize him. The dog had somehow understood that this was a child, that this was someone who needed protection, not just location. That case had made them local heroes, but it had also taken something from both of them. Rex had grown more protective, more attuned to threats against the innocent. Margaret had started having nightmares about buried children, about arriving too late, about the sound of small fists pounding against wooden walls. 6 months ago, Margaret's suburban home, retirement had been harder than either of them had expected. The pension was good. The small house on Maple Street was quiet and safe, and Rex had a backyard where he could run and play without the constant vigilance that had defined their working years. But peace, they'd discovered, was its own kind of torment. Rex had begun showing signs of what the veterinarian called purpose anxiety, the canine equivalent of a soldier struggling to adapt to civilian life. He'd pace the house at night, checking windows and doors, alert to threats that no longer existed. During the day, he'd sit by the front door, waiting for a call to duty that never came. Margaret had tried to help by taking him on long walks, teaching him new tricks, even volunteering at the local animal shelter. But she could see the restlessness in his eyes, the need to serve, to protect, to use the skills that had defined his entire adult life. That's why she'd accepted the job with Titan Security, a private firm that specialized in property protection and investigation. The work was sporadic and usually mundane, watching construction sites, sweeping buildings before demolition, providing security for corporate events. But it gave Rex a purpose, a reason to work his nose and use his training. The Jefferson Elementary job had seemed routine, The school district was tearing down the old building to make room for a new community center, and they needed a final security sweep to ensure no vagrants or dangerous materials had been left behind. Margaret had volunteered partly because the pay was good, but mostly because she'd been a student at Jefferson 30 years ago, and she wanted to say goodbye to the place where she'd first learned to read, to dream, to imagine a future beyond the small town where she'd grown up. Now standing in her old fourth-grade classroom with a hidden door gaping open like a wound in the wall, Margaret realized that some goodbyes come with secrets attached. And Rex, her faithful partner who had never failed to detect danger, was telling her that whatever lay beyond that door was anything but routine. The security guard from Titan Security was supposed to meet them at 3 p.m., but Jake Morrison, Timothy, Morrison's father, as it turned out, had called in sick with food poisoning. Margaret had offered to handle the sweep alone, confident that Rex's nose and her experience would be sufficient for what should have been a straightforward job. Now she was second-guessing that decision. "Control, this is Unit 7, she spoke into her radio, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I'm at Jefferson Elementary and I need to report an unusual finding." The radio crackled with static before the dispatcher's voice came through. "Unit 7, this is Control. Go ahead with your report." Margaret stared at the dark opening in the wall, trying to find words that wouldn't make her sound insane. "Control. Be advised that we've discovered what appears to be a concealed room or passage behind the wall in classroom 4B. The entrance was activated by my K9 unit." "Unit 7, can you clarify activated? Are you reporting a structural hazard?" Rex had moved closer to the opening, his head tilted as he tested the air currents flowing from the hidden space. His body language was tense but not aggressive. He was detecting something specific, something that required investigation but didn't pose immediate physical threat. "Negative on structural hazard, Control. My K9 partner appears to have located the trigger mechanism. The wall section has opened to reveal a concealed space. Requesting instructions." There was a longer pause before the radio crackled again. "Unit 7, this is unusual. Are you certain about the concealed space? Jefferson Elementary's blueprints show no such feature." Margaret approached the opening cautiously, pulling a small flashlight from her duty belt. The beam revealed a narrow corridor that extended beyond the reach of her light, with what appeared to be wooden flooring and paneled walls. The air that flowed from the passage carried scents that made Rex's nostrils flare. Dust, old paper, and something else that she couldn't identify, but that made her partner's ears flatten against his head. "Control, I'm looking at a corridor, approximately 4 feet wide, appears to extend at least 20 feet beyond the classroom wall. Construction appears to be consistent with the building's original era, but it's not on any plans I was provided." "Unit 7, maintain your position. I'm contacting the building supervisor and the school district. Do not enter the concealed area until we have additional personnel on scene." But Rex had other ideas. The German Shepherd took 3 steps into the corridor, his nose working the air systematically. Margaret called him back, but he turned to look at her with an expression she'd learned to recognize, the look that said he'd found something important, something that required immediate attention. "Rex, heel," she commanded, but his tail wagged once in acknowledgement before he continued deeper into the passage. Margaret had seen this behavior before, in Afghanistan and Detroit. Rex was following a scent trail, and in his mind, whatever he was tracking took precedence over her commands. "Control, my K9 unit has entered the concealed area. I'm going to follow and maintain visual contact. Unit 7, negative. Wait for backup." But Margaret was already moving, her flashlight beam dancing ahead of her as she followed Rex into the hidden corridor. The passage was narrow but well constructed, with wooden panels that showed craftsmanship from an earlier era. The floor was solid beneath her feet, and the walls were lined with what appeared to be built-in shelving and storage compartments. Rex had stopped about 15 feet into the corridor, his attention focused on a specific section of the wall. Margaret approached cautiously, her light revealing a small door or panel that had been carefully concealed within the wall's paneling. Rex was pawing at the base of the panel, his whines indicating that whatever scent he was following was strongest at this location. "What is it, boy?" she whispered, reaching for the panel. It opened easily, revealing a small compartment that contained what appeared to be a wooden box, about the size of a cigar box, covered in dust and wrapped in what looked like an old cloth. Rex's tail wagged more enthusiastically as she lifted the box from its hiding place. Whatever was inside was important to him, important enough to break protocol and lead her into this hidden space. Margaret had learned to trust her partner's instincts, even when they led her into situations that defied logic or standard procedure. The box was heavier than it looked, and when she shook it gently, she could hear something shifting inside. Not one object, but several, creating a soft rustling sound that reminded her of old papers or photographs. "Control, this is Unit 7. I've retrieved an item from the concealed area. Appears to be a wooden box, possibly containing documents or photographs. My K9 unit led me directly to this location." The radio was silent for several long seconds before the dispatcher responded. "Unit 7, what's your assessment of the situation? Any signs of recent activity or security concerns?" Margaret looked around the corridor, noting the undisturbed dust on the floor and walls. Whatever this place was, it hadn't been accessed recently. But Rex's behavior suggested that whatever was in the box was significant, possibly connected to something from the school's past. "Control, the area appears to have been sealed for years, possibly decades. No signs of recent access or security threats. However, my K9 unit is displaying behavior consistent with a significant find. Recommend we document the scene before proceeding." But even as she spoke, Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature in the corridor. Rex was staring back toward the classroom, his ears pricked forward in alert mode. Someone was coming. Someone who shouldn't be there. The footsteps in the hallway were soft but deliberate, the kind of careful movement that suggested someone trying not to be heard. Margaret killed her flashlight and pressed herself against the wall of the hidden corridor, Rex moving silently to her side. Years of training in both military and police work had taught her to trust her instincts, and right now, every instinct was screaming that something was wrong. "Hello," a voice called from the classroom. "Is someone in here? Someone in here?" Margaret recognized the voice, Dr. Eleanor Blackwood, the school district's historical preservation specialist. She was supposed to be documenting the building's architectural features before demolition, but her presence now felt like more than coincidence. "Dr. Blackwood," Margaret called out, stepping back into the classroom with the wooden box tucked under her arm. "I didn't expect to see you here today." Eleanor Blackwood was a woman in her late 60s, with silver hair pulled back, in a neat bun and intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She wore a long coat despite the warm afternoon, and carried a leather satchel that looked as old as the building itself. "I could say the same about you, Miss Holloway," Dr. Blackwood replied, her gaze immediately drawn to the open panel in the wall. "I see you've made quite a discovery." Rex moved to position himself between Margaret and Dr. Blackwood, his body language shifting from alert to protective. It was subtle, a slight lowering of his head, an almost imperceptible shift in his stance, but Margaret caught it immediately. Her partner was warning her about something. "My K9 unit detected the hidden panel," Margaret explained, watching Dr. Blackwood's reaction carefully. "We've found what appears to be a secret corridor and some kind of storage area." Dr. Blackwood stepped closer to the opening, her eyes wide with what appeared to be genuine surprise. "Remarkable. This section of the building dates to 1923, during the school's second expansion. But there's no record of hidden passages in the original architectural plans." "That's what the dispatcher told me," Margaret said, but Rex's continued alertness made her cautious. "Dr. Blackwood, did you know about this corridor?" The older woman shook her head, but there was something in her expression that didn't match her words. "Not specifically, no. But Jefferson Elementary has a complex history. The building was constructed during Prohibition, and many public buildings from that era were designed with, shall we say, unofficial features." Margaret looked down at the box in her hands. "Unofficial features?" "Hiding places, Miss Holloway. Storage areas for things that couldn't be kept in the open. You have to understand, in 1923, this was a very different world. Alcohol was illegal, but people still drank. Books were banned, but teachers still taught. Sometimes the only way to preserve important things was to hide them." Rex's ears perked up at the mention of hidden things, and he moved closer to the box Margaret was holding. His nose worked the air around it, and she could see the recognition in his eyes. Whatever scent he'd been following was definitely connected to the contents of this box. "Dr. Blackwood, I need to ask you to step back while I examine this evidence," Margaret said, using her official tone. "This is now part of a security investigation," but instead of stepping back, Dr. Blackwood moved closer. "Evidence of what, exactly?" "You're conducting a routine security sweep of a building scheduled for demolition. What crime do you think you've uncovered?" The question hit Margaret like a physical blow. What crime? She was holding a dusty box that had been hidden in a wall for decades, possibly containing nothing more than old lesson plans or forgotten school supplies. Her K9 partner had led her to it, but Rex was trained to detect explosives, drugs, and human scent trails, not historical artifacts. But then she looked into Rex's eyes and saw something that made her reconsider. This wasn't the alert posture of a dog detecting contraband or explosives. This was the same expression he'd worn when they'd found Timothy Morrison, the same intensity he'd shown when he'd detected the IED in Afghanistan. Rex had found something that mattered, something that was connected to danger or trauma. "I don't know what crime," Margaret admitted, "but my partner doesn't react this way to empty boxes or old papers. He's trained to detect human scent, and he's telling me that whatever's in this box is connected to people, specific people." Dr. Blackwood's expression changed, becoming more guarded. "Ms. Holloway, I think you may be reading too much into your dog's behavior. This is an old building with many scents and traces of the thousands of people who passed through these halls over the decades." But Margaret had spent 7 years learning to read Rex's signals, and she knew the difference between general alertness and specific recognition. "Dr. Blackwood, I need to ask you directly, do you know what's in this box?" The older woman was quiet for a long moment, her eyes moving between Margaret, Rex, and the wooden box. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer, more careful. "I know what it might contain, based on the location where you found it, and the time period when it was hidden, but I haven't seen the contents and I can't be certain without examining it." "Then let's examine it together," Margaret said, but Rex's growl stopped her. Her partner was looking at Dr. Blackwood with the same wariness he'd shown in Afghanistan when locals had approached their convoy with hidden weapons. "Dr. Blackwood," Margaret said slowly, "I think there's something you need to tell me about this school, about this corridor, and about what we've found. My K9 partner is trained to detect danger, and right now he's telling me that you represent some kind of threat." The older woman's facade cracked slightly, revealing something beneath, not malice, but fear. "Ms. Holloway, some secrets are buried, for good reasons. Some truths cause more harm than good. What you found said it's been hidden for 70 years. Perhaps it should stay hidden." But Rex had moved to the box again, his nose pressed against its surface. When he looked up at Margaret, she saw determination in his amber eyes. Whatever was in that box, her partner was certain it needed to be revealed. "I'm sorry, Dr. Blackwood, but I can't agree with that. If this box contains evidence of a crime, it's my duty to report it. And my partner is telling me that's exactly what we're dealing with." Margaret moved toward the hidden corridor, intending to examine the box in the better light of the classroom, but Dr. Blackwood's next words stopped her cold. "Ms. Holloway, before you open that box, you should know that your K9 unit isn't the first dog to find that hiding place. Another German Shepherd found it 70 years ago, and the person who hid that box, they killed the dog to keep the secret safe." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Margaret felt her grip tighten on the wooden box as Rex's body went rigid beside her, his ears flat against his head, and his lips pulled back in a silent snarl. The German Shepherd had understood the threat in Dr. Blackwood's words, even if he couldn't understand their meaning. "You're talking about murder," Margaret said, her voice steady despite the ice in her veins. "You're telling me that someone killed a dog to hide whatever's in this box." Dr. Blackwood's composure cracked further, revealing an old woman carrying a burden that had aged her beyond her years. "I'm telling you that some secrets have already cost lives. I'm asking you to consider whether you're willing to risk more. More lives." Margaret's military training kicked in, and she found herself assessing the exits, the potential weapons in the room, the tactical advantages of her position. "Dr. Blackwood, are you threatening me?" "I'm trying to save you," the older woman said, her voice breaking. "Miss Holloway, that box contains evidence of something that destroyed lives 70 years ago. The people responsible are dead, the victims are dead, and the only thing that opening it will accomplish is destroying the lives of their descendants." Rex had moved to a protective position, his body angled between Margaret and Dr. Blackwood, his muscles coiled for action. Margaret had seen him adopt this stance only twice before, once when a suspect had pulled a knife during a traffic stop, and once when a Taliban fighter had approached their checkpoint with a concealed weapon. Rex knew that violence was possible, and he was prepared to act. "I need you to explain," Margaret said, backing toward the hidden corridor. "You obviously know what's in this box. You know why it was hidden, and you know who killed a dog to protect its secrets. Start talking." Dr. Blackwood looked toward the classroom door, as if checking to see if anyone else was coming. "Ms. Holloway, my grandfather was the principal of this school from 1920 to 1955. He was a good man, respected in the community, devoted to his students. But in 1953 something happened that changed everything." "What happened?" "A student disappeared, a little girl named Sarah Fletcher. She was 8 years old in Mrs. Patterson's third-grade class. One day she was here, the next day she was gone. No trace, no explanation, no body ever found." Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. "And you think that box contains evidence about what happened to her?" "I know it does," Dr. Blackwood said quietly, "because my grandfather told me about it before he died. He said there was proof hidden in the school, proof that would destroy innocent people if it ever came to light." Rex whined softly, his nose working the air around the box. Margaret had learned to interpret his different vocalizations, and this one meant he was detecting multiple human scents, not just one person, but several. Whatever was in the box had been handled by different people at different times. "Doctor Blackwood, if there's evidence about a murdered child, it needs to be investigated. I don't care how long ago it happened or who might be hurt by the truth. But what if revealing that truth destroys the lives of people who had nothing to do with the crime?" Dr. Blackwood asked desperately. "What if the killer is already dead, but the evidence would destroy his children, his grandchildren, people who never knew what he'd done?" Margaret thought about Timothy Morrison, the boy Rex had found buried alive in a Detroit warehouse. She thought about the families of the soldiers who'd been saved by Rex's bomb detection in Afghanistan. She thought about all the victims who'd never gotten justice, because someone decided that protecting the innocent was more important than revealing the truth. "That's not how justice works," she said firmly. "Sarah Fletcher deserves justice. Her family deserves to know what happened to her." "Her family is dead," Dr. Blackwood said. "Everyone who knew her is dead. The only people who would be hurt by this revelation are the descendants of the person who killed her. And that person was my grandfather." The confession hit Margaret like a physical blow. Rex sensed her shock and moved closer, his warm presence steadying her as she processed the implications of what she'd just heard. "Your grandfather killed Sarah Fletcher?" "I don't know," Dr. Blackwood said, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I've never known for certain. He told me there was evidence hidden in the school, evidence that would destroy our family if it came to light. He made me promise never to look for it, never to reveal it, to let the truth die with him." "But you've been looking for it," Margaret realized. "That's why you're here today. You've been searching for that hiding place." "For 20 years, Dr. Blackwood admitted, ever since he died and left me with the knowledge that somewhere in this building was proof of either his guilt or his innocence. I've been through every room, every closet, every basement storage area. I never found the hidden corridor." Rex barked once, a sharp sound that echoed through the empty classroom. Margaret looked down at her partner and saw him staring at the wooden box with an intensity that made her heart race. Whatever was inside, Rex was certain it was important. "Dr. Blackwood, step back," Margaret ordered, her voice carrying the authority of her military and police training. "I'm opening this box. Please," the older woman begged. "Think about what you're doing. Think about the lives you might destroy." But Margaret was already moving, setting the box on a nearby desk and examining the simple latch that held it closed. Rex positioned himself beside her, his eyes never leaving Dr. Blackwood as Margaret's fingers worked the old metal mechanism. The latch clicked open with a sound that seemed to echo through the decades. Margaret lifted the lid, and Rex's tail began to wag frantically as the scents trapped inside the box were released into the air. Inside, wrapped in yellowed tissue paper and tied with a faded ribbon, were dozens of photographs. And on top of the photographs, in a child's careful handwriting, was a note that made Margaret's blood run cold. "If something happens to me, these pictures will show who hurt the other children. I hid them where the bad man can't find them. My name is Sarah Fletcher, and I'm 8 years old." Dr. Blackwood's sob filled the silence as Margaret realized the truth. Sarah Fletcher hadn't been murdered to hide a secret. She'd been murdered because she'd discovered one. And somewhere in that box of hidden photographs was evidence of crimes that had been buried for 70 years. Rex barked again, but this time his attention was focused on the classroom door. Someone else was coming. Someone who'd been waiting for this moment, watching for the day when Sarah Fletcher's secret would finally be revealed. The footsteps in the hallway were different this time, heavier, more purposeful. And when the door opened, Margaret found herself face to face with a man she'd never seen before, but whose eyes held the same desperate fear she'd seen in Dr. Blackwood's. "Nobody move," he said quietly, and Margaret saw the gun in his hand. "That box goes back where you found it, right now." Rex's growl filled the classroom with menace, his hackles raised as he positioned himself between Margaret and the gunman. The German Shepherd's training kicked in instantly. He recognized the weapon, the threat posture, the danger to his handler. But Margaret's hand signal kept him in check, even as every muscle in his body coiled for attack. "Easy, Rex," she said quietly, never taking her eyes off the stranger. "Who are you, and why do you want that box hidden?" The man was in his 60s, well dressed in a way that suggested money and status, but his hands shook as he held the pistol. His eyes kept darting between Margaret, Dr. Blackwood, and the open box on the desk, as if he couldn't decide which posed the greatest threat. "My name is Charles Blackwood," he said, and Margaret saw Dr. Blackwood's face go white. "Eleanor's brother? And that box contains lies that will destroy everything our family has built." "Charles," Dr. Blackwood whispered, "I told you to stay away. I told you I could handle this." "Handle it?" Charles's voice cracked with desperation. "You've been searching for this damned box for 20 years, Ellie. Every time the school district talked about renovations, every time they mentioned demolition, you found a way to get inside and look for it. You think I didn't know?" Margaret's mind raced as she processed the family dynamics. Rex remained alert beside her, his amber eyes never leaving Charles Blackwood's gun hand. She could feel the tension in her partner's body, the way he was calculating. Distance and attack angles waiting for her command. "Mr. Blackwood," she said carefully, "put the gun down and let's talk about this. Whatever's in that box, violence isn't going to solve anything." "You don't understand," Charles said, his voice breaking. "Our grandfather wasn't just the principal of this school. He was a pillar of the community, a man everyone respected. The Blackwood name has meant something in this town for 70 years. Our children, our grandchildren, they've all benefited from the reputation he built. Margaret looked down at the box, at Sarah Fletcher's childish handwriting on the note that promised to reveal who had hurt the other children. The photographs beneath the note were still wrapped in tissue paper, but Rex's continued interest in them suggested they contained scents that told a story of multiple victims. "Your grandfather hurt children," Margaret said, her voice steady despite the horror of the realization. "Sarah Fletcher discovered evidence of it, and he killed her to keep her quiet." "No!" Charles shouted, the gun wavering in his grip. "That's not... He wasn't... Grandfather was a good man. He loved children. He devoted his life to education, to helping kids learn and grow." Dr. Blackwood stepped forward, tears streaming down her face. "Charles, we have to face the truth. Grandfather's confession before he died, the way he made me promise never to look for the evidence. He was telling us that he'd done something terrible." "He was protecting us," Charles insisted. "He was protecting the family name from false accusations. Sarah Fletcher was a troubled child, everyone knew that. She made up stories, caused problems. Whatever's in that box, it's lies she created to get attention." But Rex had moved closer, to the desk, his nose working the air around the photographs. Margaret had learned to read her partner's body language like a book, and right now he was telling her that the scents in that box were real, significant, and connected to trauma. Rex had found too many victims over the years to be fooled by false evidence. "Mr. Blackwood," Margaret said, "my canine partner is trained to detect human scent, blood, and other biological evidence. He's telling me that those photographs contain traces of real victims. Sarah Fletcher wasn't making up stories." "Your dog is wrong," Charles said desperately. "Dogs make mistakes. They get confused by old scents, by—" His words were cut off by Rex's sharp bark. The German Shepherd had moved to a specific section of the classroom floor, near the windows, where he was pawing at the wooden boards with the same intensity he'd shown at the chalkboard. Margaret realized that her partner was detecting something else, something connected to the photographs but separate from them. "Rex has found another scent trail," she said, understanding flooding through her. "The photographs aren't the only evidence, are they? There's something else hidden in this room." Dr. Blackwood and Charles both stared at the spot where Rex was, digging, their faces pale with recognition. Margaret knelt beside her partner, running her hands over the floorboards until she found one that was slightly loose, slightly different from the others. "Don't," Charles pleaded, but Margaret was already working the board free. Beneath it, wrapped in oilcloth and preserved by the dry air under the floor, was a small leather journal. Rex's tail wagged as Margaret lifted the journal from its hiding place. The cover was marked with the same childish handwriting they'd seen on the note to Sarah's secret book. She kept a diary, Margaret realized. "Sarah Fletcher documented everything she saw, everything she discovered about your grandfather's crimes, and she hid the evidence in 2 different places to make sure it would be found." Charles Blackwood's gun hand dropped to his side as the weight of 70 years of lies crashed down on him. Dr. Blackwood sank into a nearby chair, her face buried in her hands, sobbing with the grief of finally knowing the truth about the man who'd raised her. Margaret opened the journal carefully, Rex pressing close to her side as she read the first entry aloud. October 15, 1953. "Today I saw Mr. Blackwood hurt Tommy in the storage room. Tommy was crying and bleeding. Mr. Blackwood saw me watching and told me if I ever told anyone, he would hurt me like he hurt the others. But I'm going to tell. I'm going to take pictures and write everything down so people will believe me." The entries continued, each one more horrifying than the last, documenting a pattern of abuse that had gone on for years. Sarah Fletcher had been methodical in her documentation, taking photographs with a camera she'd found in the school storage room, hiding the evidence where she thought it would be safe. "The last entry," Margaret said, her voice thick with emotion, "is dated November 30th, 1953. Mr. Blackwood knows I have the pictures. He said he's going to make me disappear like he made Jenny disappear last year. I'm scared. I'm going to hide this book and the pictures in different places. If something happens to me, I hope someone finds them and makes him pay for what he's done." Rex whined softly, pressing against Margaret's leg, as if he could sense the pain and fear that had been trapped in those pages for 70 years. The German Shepherd had helped her find justice for many victims over the years, but none had been hidden for so long, their voices silenced for so many decades. The silence in the classroom was broken by Charles Blackwood's anguished sob. The gun fell from his fingers and clattered to the floor as he collapsed into a chair, his face in his hands. 70 years, he whispered. 70 years we've lived with his reputation, built our lives on his memory. Our children named their kids after him. The town named a street after him. How do we live with this? Dr. Blackwood looked up from her hands, her eyes red with tears but her voice steady. "We live with it by making sure Sarah Fletcher finally gets justice. We live with it by admitting what our grandfather did and helping the families of his victims find peace." But Rex had moved to the window, his ears pricked forward and his body tense with alertness. Margaret followed his gaze and saw several cars pulling up outside the school, police vehicles, and what looked like news vans. Someone called the media, she realized. Word about the discovery is already getting out. Charles Blackwood's face went white with panic. No, this can't get out. The reporters, the scandal, it will destroy everyone. My children, my grandchildren, they'll be marked for life, as the descendants of a child killer. Mr. Blackwood, Margaret said firmly, the truth is going to come out whether we control it or not. The question is whether you're going to face it with dignity or let it destroy you with shame. Rex barked once, sharp and authoritative, as footsteps echoed in the hallway outside. Margaret recognized the sound of tactical boots, the measured pace of law enforcement responding to a situation. Her radio crackled to life. Unit 7, this is Control. We have reports of a possible hostage situation at your location. What's your status? Margaret keyed her radio, her eyes never leaving Charles Blackwood. Control, this is Unit 7. Situation is under control. We have 3 civilians in the classroom, no injuries. Suspect is disarmed. However, we have uncovered evidence of historical crimes that will require immediate investigation. Unit 7, maintain your position. Detectives and crime scene units are en route. Charles Blackwood stood up shakily, his hands raised as he realized the magnitude of what was about to happen. Ms. Holloway, I need you to understand something. I'm not a bad man. I never hurt anyone. I was just trying to protect my family from something that happened before I was even born. I know, Margaret said softly, but Sarah Fletcher was 8 years old when your grandfather killed her. She deserves justice, even if it comes 70 years too late. Rex moved to the box of photographs, his nose working the evidence one more time. Margaret watched her partner's behavior and realized something that made her heart race. Rex is detecting fresh scents on these photographs, she said, looking at Dr. Blackwood with new understanding. Recent human contact. Dr. Blackwood, you have seen these pictures before, haven't you? The older woman's face crumbled. 20 years ago, when I first started searching for the hiding place, I found a loose board in the storage room downstairs. There was a single photograph that had fallen out of the main collection, a picture of a little girl who looked terrified. I knew then that grandfather's confession was true. But you put it back, Margaret realized. You found evidence that could have brought justice to Sarah Fletcher and the other victims, and you hid it again. I was a coward, Dr. Blackwood admitted. I was more concerned about protecting my family's reputation than honoring the memory of murdered children. I've lived with that shame for 20 years. The classroom door opened, and Detective Ray Martinez from the local police entered, his weapon drawn but lowered. Margaret had worked with Ray during her time with the Detroit police, and she was relieved to see a familiar face in the chaos. Margaret, Ray said, taking in the scene, the hidden corridor, the open box, the 2 crying siblings, and Rex standing guard over the evidence. What the hell have you stumbled into? A 70-year-old murder case, Margaret replied. Multiple victims, Ray. Children who were abused and killed by the school's principal in the 1950s. My K9 unit led me to evidence that's been hidden in the walls since 1953. Rex barked once in acknowledgement, his tail wagging as he recognized Ray's voice. The German Shepherd had worked with the detective before, and his presence seemed to ease some of the tension in the room. Jesus, Ray muttered, approaching the desk where Sarah Fletcher's journal and photographs lay open. This is going to be the biggest cold case breakthrough in the department's history. Charles Blackwood stepped forward, his hands still raised. Detective, I want to cooperate fully with your investigation. I brought a weapon to this scene, and I threatened Ms. Holloway. I'll accept whatever charges you need to file. But you didn't hurt anyone, Ray observed, and you're clearly not the perpetrator of the original crimes. What made you think you needed to suppress this evidence? Fear, Charles said simply. Fear of what the truth would do to innocent people who had nothing to do with my grandfather's crimes. But I realize now that suppressing the truth only makes the pain worse. Sarah Fletcher and the other victims deserve justice no matter how long it takes. Rex moved to Margaret's side, pressing against her leg as he sensed the emotional weight of the moment. The German Shepherd had found many victims over the years, but none whose stories had been buried for so long. Margaret scratched behind his ears, grateful for the partner who had led her to this moment of truth. Within hours, the story had exploded across local and national media. Hidden Chamber reveals 70-year-old child murder case, screamed the headlines, accompanied by photographs of Margaret and Rex emerging from Jefferson Elementary with the evidence that would rewrite the town's history. The school district called an emergency meeting. The mayor held a press conference, The police department established a task force to investigate related cold cases from the 1950s, and through it all, Rex remained by Margaret's side, his calm presence anchoring her as the world erupted in chaos around them. "Your dog is a hero," Detective Martinez told Margaret as they watched the crime scene technicians carefully photograph and catalogue every piece of evidence from Sarah Fletcher's hiding places. Without his nose, this case would have died with the building's demolition. Rex's ears perked up at the praise, but his attention remained focused on the investigation. Margaret watched her partner's behavior and realized something that made her proud beyond words. "He's not done yet," she said. "Rex is still detecting scents, still following trails. There's more evidence to be found," and she was right. Over the next 3 days, Rex led investigators to 2 more hiding places in the school. One in the basement where they found victims' personal belongings, and another in the attic where Sarah Fletcher had hidden additional photographs and a list of names. The list contained the names of 12 children who had attended Jefferson Elementary between 1950 and 1953. 7 of those children had been reported as runaways. 2 had been found dead in what were ruled accidental drownings. 3 had simply disappeared without a trace. "It's worse than we thought," Detective Martinez told Margaret as they stood in the school's main hallway, Rex resting at their feet after another successful search. "We're not just looking at Sarah Fletcher's murder. We're looking at a serial killer who used his position as principal to prey on vulnerable children for years." The community's reaction was swift and devastating. The Blackwood Street sign was taken down within a week. The elementary school named after Principal Blackwood in the neighboring town was renamed. Charles and Eleanor Blackwood received death threats from angry parents and community members who felt betrayed by the 70-year-old deception. But there were other reactions too. Families of the victims, some of whom had spent decades wondering what happened to their missing relatives, finally had answers. Support groups formed for the descendants of the murdered children, and a movement began to establish a memorial for Sarah Fletcher and the other victims. "Your grandfather was a monster," Margaret told Dr. Blackwood during one of their interviews with the police. "But that doesn't make you a monster. The courage you're showing now, the way you're helping us find the truth, that's who you really." Rex seemed to agree, approaching Dr. Blackwood with the gentle demeanor he reserved for victims and their families. The German Shepherd had learned to recognize the difference between perpetrators and those who were simply caught up in the aftermath of crimes, and his acceptance of Dr. Blackwood helped ease her guilt. Charles Blackwood, meanwhile, had become an unlikely advocate for the victims. He used his family's wealth to establish a foundation for missing children, and he worked with genealogists to track down the descendants of his grandfather's victims. "I can't bring those children back," he told Margaret during the trial, where he pled guilty to weapons charges and received community service. "But I can make sure their names are remembered, their stories are told, and their families receive the support they deserve." The media attention was overwhelming, but Margaret found herself focusing on the positive aspects of the coverage. Rex's story, the faithful K9 who had uncovered a decades-old conspiracy of murder and silence, inspired people across the country. Donations poured in for K9 units and missing children organizations. Other cold cases received renewed attention as people realized that sometimes the truth was just waiting for the right nose to find it. 6 months after the discovery at Jefferson Elementary, Margaret stood in the town square as they unveiled the memorial to Sarah Fletcher and the other victims. The bronze statue depicted a young girl reading a book with the inscription, "Sarah Fletcher and the Forgotten Children of Jefferson Elementary, their voices will never be silenced again." Rex sat beside her, his grey muzzle showing his age but his eyes still sharp with intelligence and purpose. The German Shepherd had received commendations from the mayor, the police department and the FBI for his role in solving the case. But Margaret knew that awards and recognition weren't what motivated her partner. Rex's satisfaction came from the work itself, from the knowledge that his nose and instincts had brought justice to children who had been forgotten for too long. "He's slowing down," the veterinarian had told Margaret during Rex's recent checkup. "His joints are getting stiff, and his hearing isn't what it used to be, but his nose is still as sharp as ever and his heart is still strong." Margaret had nodded, understanding what the doctor wasn't saying directly. Rex was nearing the end of his working life, entering the phase where most K-9 units retired to become family pets. But the Jefferson Elementary case had given him something that she'd feared he might never find again, a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with duty rosters or training exercises. "We did good work, didn't we, boy?" she said softly, scratching behind his ears as they watched the crowd gathered around the memorial. "Sarah Fletcher can rest in peace now. All of them can." Rex's tail wagged once, a gentle acknowledgement that said more than words ever could. The German Shepherd had spent his entire adult life protecting the innocent and finding the lost. The fact that some of the lost had been missing for 70 years didn't matter to him. Justice had no expiration date in Rex's world. Dr. Eleanor. Blackwood approached them, moving slowly but with dignity. She had aged visibly in the month since the discovery, but there was peace in her face that hadn't been there before. "Ms. Holloway," she said, "I wanted to thank you and Rex one more time. I know this has been difficult for everyone involved, but you gave us the truth, and sometimes the truth is the only thing that can set us free." Margaret nodded, understanding. The weight of what Dr. Blackwood had endured. Learning that your grandfather was a serial killer would be devastating for anyone, but finding the courage to help investigators uncover the full extent of his crimes took a special kind of strength. "Have you heard from the other families?" Margaret asked. "Some of them," Dr. Blackwood replied. "The Hendersons, Jenny's family, invited me to her memorial service last month. They said they didn't blame me for what my grandfather did, that they were grateful to finally know what happened to their daughter. It was healing, I think, for all of us." Rex had been listening to their conversation with the patient attention he gave to all human interactions, but now his ears perked up as a familiar figure approached. Detective Martinez was walking toward them, carrying a folder that looked official. "Margaret." "Rex," he said with a smile, "I have some news I thought you'd want to hear. The FBI has officially closed the case on Principal Blackwood's crimes, but they've reopened investigations into 12 other missing children cases from the same time period in neighboring counties. Rex's work here has sparked a regional task force." Margaret felt a surge of pride in her partner. "More children who need justice? More children who might finally get it," Martinez confirmed. "The FBI wants to know if you and Rex would be interested in consulting on some of the cases. Nothing too strenuous, just using Rex's nose to search locations where evidence might be hidden." Margaret looked down at Rex, who was watching her with the same intensity he'd shown in the classroom 6 months ago. Despite his age, despite the wear and tear of 7 years of service, her partner was telling her that he still had work to do. "What do you think, boy?" she asked. "Ready for one more mission?" Rex's bark was sharp and clear, filled with the same determination that had led him to scratch at a chalkboard and uncover a 70-year-old secret. Age might be slowing his body, but his spirit was as strong as ever. Margaret smiled, feeling the same sense of purpose that had carried them through Afghanistan, Detroit, and now into this new chapter of their partnership. "Detective Martinez, tell the FBI that we're interested. Rex and I aren't quite ready to retire yet." As the sun set over the memorial service, Margaret and Rex walked slowly through town, past the house where they lived their quiet retirement, past the school where children played safely in the knowledge that monsters like Principal Blackwood could no longer hide in the shadows. But their walk took them inevitably to the site where Jefferson Elementary had once stood. The building had been demolished 2 months after the discovery, but the hidden corridor had been preserved as part of a crime scene investigation that was still ongoing. Rex approached the cordoned-off area and sat down, his nose working the air one more time. Margaret watched her partner's behavior and realized that he was saying goodbye to Sarah Fletcher, to the other victims, to the dark secrets that had been buried for so long. "Thank you," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she was thanking Rex or Sarah Fletcher, or the forces of justice that had finally brought truth to light. "Thank you for never giving up." As they walked home together in the gathering twilight, Margaret realized that Rex's greatest gift wasn't his nose, or his training, or even his courage. His greatest gift was his absolute faith that the truth would always surface, that justice would always find a way, and that the innocent would never be forgotten as long as someone was willing to keep looking. The German shepherd who had once scratched at a chalkboard to reveal a hidden door had opened something far more important, a door to the past that had allowed the voices of murdered children to finally be heard. In doing so, he had proven that some bonds transcend time, that some stories demand to be told, and that some secrets are too important to stay buried. Rex never scratched at another chalkboard again, not because he had lost his instincts, but because he had already accomplished something far greater than anyone had thought possible. He had given voice to the voiceless, justice to the forgotten, and peace to the families who had waited 70 years for the truth. In the end, that was all any hero could hope to achieve.